Welcome back, 5th graders, to another Read Aloud. For this Read Aloud, my class has picked the Dumb Crooks Hall of Shame book. So, this is a book about a bunch of criminals that got caught doing some not so intelligent things. So, let's see. Hoping this is a pretty interesting and funny book, as it's the first time I have read it as well. So we'll be learning and reading about it together. So let's get started. The first part here is a little prologue that's titled, Dumbest of the Dumb. Our prisons and jails are crammed with hardened felons, chronic crooks, and bad choice troublemakers. Some of these miscreants are the most inept lawbreakers this side of the straight and narrow. These lame brains find themselves behind bars because they are so good at being so bad in their illegal activities. Their outrageous, ridiculous, and mortifying examples of incompetence have brought disgrace to themselves and to the memories of infamous bad guys who did time in notorious lockups from Alcatraz to Sing Sing. These imprisoned imbeciles are too bungling to ever make the FBI's 10 most wanted list, or to be named in a police department's all-points bulletin. Nevertheless, they deserve recognition, if only for their denseness. Well, they now have their own special distinction as members of the Dumb Crooks Hall of Shame. There is no actual museum or building dedicated to criminal craziness. If there were such an institution, it would probably stretch several blocks to accommodate all the awards and memorabilia for the goofs and gaffes, bloopers and blunders that burglars, thieves, robbers, and other wrongdoers have committed over the years. Even though no such brick-and-mortar galley of dishonor exists, this book attempts to shame a relatively recent sampling of some of the jaw-droppingest, eye-poppingest, head-slappingest, yes, these are made-up words illegal in the state of grammar, moments ever perpetrated by preposterous perpetrators. The selection process for induction into the hall involves certain standards. All the stories had to be true and come from police files, court documents, and trusted media accounts. For each nitwit up for consideration, the author asks such questions as, will the story make the reader laugh? And is it so outlandish or silly that the reader will shake his head or her head in disbelief? If the answer was yes to those questions, then it has an excellent chance of making the cut. Among the criminal misfits inducted into the Dumb Crooks Hall of Shame, you will read about the knucklehead who was easily recognized and captured because he covered his face in a see-through plastic bag during a robbery, the foolish fugitive who was nabbed 15 minutes after taunting the police on Facebook, the dense purse snatcher who knocked himself unconscious when he sprinted into a glass window that he thought was an open door, the brainless bank robber who was arrested the day after she posted a YouTube video of herself bragging about her crime, the idiot who, while running from the police, climbed a fence and landed on the other side, not knowing it was a prison yard, and the loser who tried and failed miserably to carjack a minivan, one full of members of a judo club. In some ways, it's easy to understand how these buffoons ended up in such disrepute. If you have crooked thoughts, it's hard to think straight. So the first chapter is the Witless Wonder Awards. For failing to show a lick of common sense, the Dumb Crooks Hall of Shame inducts the following. The first one is called Cuckoo Caller, and it was a bank robbery. This crook was under the harebrained assumption that robbing a bank was no different from phoning in an order for a pizza pickup. So he called a teller 10 minutes ahead of time, demanding that the bank have money waiting for him and his accomplice to steal. You might say this was a judgment call, one based on bad judgment. The 27-year-old masterminded, please read that word with sarcasm, called a branch of the People's United Bank in Fairfield, Connecticut one afternoon in 2010 and told a teller, I want $100,000 in large bills and no die packs. I will be sending someone into the bank to get the money. Don't call the police. We are monitoring the police scanner. After the call ended, the teller ignored his threat because, Well, what crook would be dumb enough to warn the bank ahead of time that he's going to rob it? The teller immediately phoned police. Meanwhile, bank employers tried to lock the doors before the accomplice, who turned out to be the caller's 16-year-old cousin, showed up. But they were too late. The teen was already inside the bank and had placed a briefcase on the teller's counter. The caller phoned the bank again and spoke to his supervisor. He asked her if she saw his associate. When she replied yes, he said, "Don't make a scene, because we will take hostages." Once again, the caller wasn't taken that seriously. A teller put only $900 in a dye pack in the briefcase. At the teenager's request, witnesses said he was very polite. He was let out of the bank. He then ran to a nearby parking lot, where the caller was waiting in a car. Also waiting nearby was a police officer. With his gun drawn, he ordered them to freeze. One of the perps threw the money onto the ground just as the dye pack exploded, coloring the cash in red. The duo surrendered after other cops surrounded the car. After the other cops surrounded the car. Inside the vehicle, officers found a radio scanner tuned to the Fairfield Police Department's frequency, 2 walkie-talkies, and a robbery to-do list that included times for getting into and out of the bank. The teacher was sent to a juvenile detention facility. His older genius cousin eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit second-degree robbery, being a persistent, dangerous felony offender and harassment. He faced 9 years in prison. Perhaps that will be a wake-up call for him. "You can't make this stuff up," Police Sergeant James Perez told the Connecticut Post. "They literally called the bank and said to have the bag of money ready on the floor because they're coming to rob the place. And then they actually show up as the police are rolling in. I would classify these individuals as not too bright. They should have spent time in school instead of trying to rob a bank." The next one is called The Barefaced Bandit, and it's another robbery. No one will ever confuse this pinhead with being a master of disguise. To hide his identity during a robbery of a gas station, he wore a plastic bag over his head. A see-through plastic bag. Was it any wonder that a cop instantly recognized him in the street from the security footage taken at the scene of the crime? The 41-year-old knucklehead and his 20-year-old pal were sitting in a home in Bethel, Cornwall, England, when they decided to rob a gas station/convenience store in nearby St. Austell in 2012. Because they didn't have masks or hoodies to conceal their faces, they grabbed the nearest things they could find. A few steps from the store, the younger one wrapped a scarf over his head, covering everything but his eyes. For some unfathomable reason, the older one chose to hide his face in a clear plastic bag. Neither crook had a weapon, but the younger simpleton came up with what he thought was a brilliant idea as the transparent bag. He would use his cell as a pretend gun. With their so-called disguises, the pair entered the store and told the lone employee, Kim Close, that this was a stick-up. Covering his phone as best he could with his hands, the younger one pointed it at the worker and demanded she hand over all the cash in the register. Too bad at that very moment, the screen on his phone lit up. Realizing that the man with the scarf around his head was not wielding a pistol, but only a harmless cell phone, Klaus pressed a button that set off the alarm. Meanwhile, Mr. Clear plastic bag on his head jumped over the counter and wrestled with her. The two culprits then snared several bottles of booze and ran off. When the police arrived, they studied video from the security camera. The bagman's face was easily visible through the see-through disguise. His image was then distributed among police. 2 days later, off-duty Detective Constable Lauren Holly was driving her mother home when she spotted the suspect on the street and recognized him as the dummy in the video. After she called for backup, he was arrested, and so was his bird-brained buddy. In 2013, the two were convicted of the robbery and sentenced to 2 years behind bars. Detective Constable Steve White, who investigated the case, said the robber's transparent disguise was the most ridiculous one he had ever seen. The British media had a field day with the story on their websites. next to a screenshot of the security video showing the nitwit wearing the clear plastic bag, the websites ask similar questions. The Daily Mail. Is this Britain's stupidest crook? Metro.co.uk. Worst disguise ever? The Sun. Britain's daftest criminal. The answers? Yes, yes, and yes. The next crook is called Marked Man and attempted burglary. These two blockheaded burglars were quick on the draw, but slow on the uptake. They didn't mess with ski masks or stockings over their heads to hide their identity. Nope. They tried to disguise themselves by drawing beards and mustaches on their faces with permanent markers. In 2009, witnesses in Carroll, Iowa, called police and reported seeing two men in hooded jackets and with white ink scribbled all over their faces trying to break into a residence. The suspects left before police responded to the attempted burglary. However, the cops were given a good description of the getaway car. A short while later, the police pulled over a car matching the description of the suspect's vehicle, a 1994 Buick Roadmaster. The cops were startled and amused to see the man had drawn fake beards, mustaches, and streaks on their faces. Trying to explain why they marked up their mugs made the suspects, in a way, con artists. The officers were kind of laughing at the time, Carroll, police chief of Jeff Carler, told CNN. I've never heard of coloring your face with a permanent marker. In an understatement, the chief added, they probably were just not thinking straight. They were being dumb. Authorities didn't need to have a picture drawn to determine what the pair was up to. The marked men were charged with second-degree attempted burglary. Because their mugshots, which were taken with the permanent marker, still scrawled on their faces, went viral, Kaler was fielding calls from news media outlets throughout the country. I've been chief here almost 25 years, been with the department 28 and a half years, and I've seen a lot of weird things that make me laugh, he told CNN. But this was probably the best combination of the two. Strangely weird and hilariously funny all at the same time. This next story is called Donut Nut, and this one is larceny. You would think that if you're on the run from the cops, the last thing you'd want to do is compete against them in a donut eating contest. But then you're not this hall of shamer. He not only entered the competition, he won it. Naturally, his achievement garnered a photo and story in the local paper, a paper read by the police, who then realized the winner of their contest was really the larcenous loser who had eluded arrest for 9 months. They nabbed him the next day. 24-year-old lunkhead, who was from Elizabeth City, North Carolina, had been wanted for several felony break-ins in Camden County in 2013. The cops couldn't find him, and word on the street was that he had skipped town. In 2014, the Elizabeth City Police Department held a national night out against crime event, which included a donut eating contest featuring several competitors from local law enforcement agencies. Whether it was out of sheer audacity or a deep-fried love for donuts, the numbskull entered the tournament. The officers didn't pay close attention to him or the other civilian competitors, and certainly didn't think that a wanted man would stupidly show up in their midst. But those donuts were just too tempting for this fugitive. After downing 8 glazed donuts in 2 minutes, he was crowned the champion. The local newspaper, the Daily Advance, ran a story about his victory, and that's when authorities recognized him and discovered he was back in town. Deputies for the Camden County Sheriff's Office found him at his mother's residence and arrested him. When I came in that morning and read that article, I was angry because it's like throwing it in our face, Lieutenant Max Robertson told local TV station My Fox 8. We've been looking for him for months. I didn't ask him if he won a trophy. He probably did. Robertson said that after the crook was arrested, I didn't congratulate him on winning the contest. Good for him. He can eat a lot of donuts. Good for him. Authorities do not know if the fugitive had a glazed expression when he was apprehended. Ha ha, donut humor. The next one is called Nervous Nellie, an attempted bank robbery. Robbing a bank requires nerves of steel. The only nerves possessed by this would-be bank robber were made of jelly. He was so jumpy and scared that he foiled his own crime with a blunder that startled everyone, including himself. Wearing sunglasses and a flat cap, the stocky, unshaven young man walked into a branch of Halifax Bank in London in 2011. He had hidden a gun in one hand and clutched an empty bag in the other. When he reached the teller's window, he showed the weapon and demanded the cashier put £700,000, that's about $870,000, in the bag. So far, so good, but then he royally messed up. The nervous Nellie placed on the counter what he thought was the empty bag for the money. Instead, he unthinkingly handed the bank employee the gun. There was a momentary pause when the teller and Crooke froze in disbelief. Did I just hand the teller my gun, the robber thought? Did the robber just give me his gun, the teller thought? Seconds later, they both made a grab for the weapon. Witnessing the goofy gaffe, bank employees immediately sounded the alarm. The jittery thief was so flustered that he fled, pedaling off on a motorcycle that he had stolen from a bank worker on the way out. A source for the City of London Police told the Telegraph, "The guess is that he is very inexperienced and panicked when he approached the cashier, handing his gun over instead of the bag by mistake. This man is not the sharpest tool in the box." And the last one we're going to read for this video is Writer's Blockhead, Attempted Bank Robbery. You might think penmanship doesn't matter, but it does. A sloppily written sentence could lead to a prison sentence. According to police in Anatok, California in 2014, this half-wit walked into a branch of Wells Fargo Bank, went over to a teller, and handed her a 9-word note that he had scribbled. Without saying anything, he stood there while she read the note, or at least tried to read it. The problem was, she couldn't make out what it said because his handwriting was so bad. The customer wasn't talking, so the teller excused herself and asked her manager to help decipher the note. Together, the two employees determined that the note said, in a very ungrammatical way, "This is a bank robbery. Hand over all the money." By the time they figured out the man's intentions, the loon had seen the writing on the wall. He was not going to pull off this robbery. He bolted out through the bank's rear door. Although no money was taken, an employee called the police. Based on a detailed description of the suspect and security camera images, the police found the perp at a nearby shopping center and arrested him for attempted robbery, as well as violation of parole from a previous conviction. Because his penmanship was nothing to write home about, he now had the time behind bars to try to right this wrong. Get it? Right this wrong? Homophone humor. All right, friends, that kind of puts us at the end of this video. For our next read aloud, we will finish chapter 1 and see what other bird brain crooks did to end up in the Dumb Crooks Hall of Shame. For Big Bear, I'm Mr. Lures. We'll see you at the next read aloud, friends.